Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about garden news, botanical history, and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is April 14th. Today we celebrate a German landscape and flower painter who was forbidden to paint by her father. We'll also learn about a self-taught botanist who spent nearly a dozen years in the Amazon rainforest. We'll hear an excerpt about spring from a man who wrote A Farewell to Arms. And we grow that garden library today with a book about one of the 19th century's top botanical illustrators. And he's also a favorite of mine. And then we'll wrap things up with a little story from the 2017 Beijing Crabapple Conference. And if you're like me, I didn't even know there was such a thing as a crabapple conference, but I love it. I love the idea. It's time for today's curated news. Today's curated news is an article that was recently posted by my friend Pam Pennick, the garden blogger, over at her website called Digging. And Pam's post is titled, My Trees, Alive, Dead, or In Between, Evaluating Plants 2 months after the Texas freeze. Well, now, I was so excited when Pam posted that she had written this article because Pam is a pro. She's been blogging about plants for a very long time. She's got to be one of the very first garden bloggers on the planet. And if Pam was worried about her Austin trees, which ones were going to make it and which ones weren't, well, to me, that's just a good reminder that as gardeners, we have so much in common. And when bad weather strikes, even experts can be left scratching their heads or even holding their breath, waiting to see what the future is going to hold when it comes to their garden, when it comes to some of their favorite plants. Pam starts out her post this way. It's been 2 months since the big freeze of mid-February, and my garden, which thankfully has many thrivers, is still revealing struggling survivors and dead as doornails. During these past 2 months, temperatures have ranged from a low of 5 degrees Fahrenheit to an unseasonable high of 92 degrees just a few days ago. And that's an 87-degree temperature swing. And then Pam writes, poor plants, but some have already proven their mettle. Now, in this post, Pam points out that in some cases, plants are just much more resilient than we give them credit for. But in addition, there are things like microclimates, which really can help protect plants that experience big temperature extremes. Then, of course, you have to factor in whether or not there's snow cover that can act as an insulator, whether or not the ground is quick draining, that can be absolutely essential, and whether or not the plant or tree is brand new or is firmly established in the garden. And I love what Pam wrote here. Now, bear in mind, Pam has probably been gardening for about as long as I have, so I will say probably 3 decades. And she writes this, all of which is to say that this was a highly unusual event, and even longtime gardeners don't necessarily know how certain species will respond, much less individual plants in varying conditions. And again, I share this little snippet with you to hopefully make you feel more confident in your own questioning about your garden. Do you know that there was a moment this year when I was speaking to a gardener who had shared with me that they had gardened for decades before they would even consider calling themselves a gardener? And that is such a common feeling. And the reason for that is actually quite simple. It's because gardening is a skill and it's something that you need to learn. And because the topic is so broad, it's situational, it's experiential. And to a certain extent, I think a lot of it has to do with how quickly your brain can process and retain information. There's so much about the garden, particular plants or trees, that's seasonal. It's information we need for the month of April. And then the whole rest of the year, we don't need that information anymore. And so our brains kind of tuck it away, and it can be hard to recall. And so if you have a garden friend that has exceptional memory and exceptional recall, you can feel that as a gardener, you just don't measure up. But that is just simply not the case. And so I share Pam's post today for a couple of different reasons. I want to highlight that this is a woman who has gardened for decades, and even she was, one, very worried about her garden, two, very uncertain about what was going to make it and what was not going to make it, and three, very surprised. In fact, some of the things she was certain would survive sadly did not. And then she had marvelous surprises where some of her plants and trees ended up being much more resilient than she ever dared hope. And then the other reason I wanted to share Pam's post with you is because I was morbidly curious about what it would be like for these Texas gardeners who had gone through that dreadful freeze during that week back in February. And I'm betting that you share the same curiosity. Now, one of the things I want to point out with regard to Pam's post is that I really like how she laid this out, because she begins by talking about this experience and then going through her garden. But the best thing that she did in my mind is that she just laid it all out in a nice little list, and it's toward the end of her post. She starts out with the trees. She labels them all. She shares their botanical Latin name in addition to their common name. And then she talks about what happened to that tree. So, for instance, Japanese maple. Pam writes, in perfect health, no discernible damage or delay in leafing out, and neighbors have been commenting on how pretty it looks. Now, this to me is fascinating because I have tried numerous times to grow a Japanese maple on my property. I have no business doing that because I am in a zone 4A, and so it's right on the border. And those really belong in a zone 5, but it's fascinating to hear that they could withstand 4 terrible days of extreme cold in Texas. Now, here's an example of a tree that didn't make it. Pam writes about her Mexican orchid tree. She writes, killed. Extended hard freezes normally kill this plant to the roots. This freeze was just too cold for too long. Anyway, isn't that wonderful how Pam did this? I love the list that she goes through. She lists about 30 different trees here, and then she shares these little comments, which I think are fascinating. And then in the coming weeks, Pam is going to do the same thing for her shrubs, her subshrubs, and her woody perennials. And of course, part of that may be she just needs to give some of them a little bit more time to see whether or not they're going to bounce back, if they do at all. Now, of course, I definitely want to take a second and encourage you to follow Pam's blog. Again, it's called Digging. Pam gardens in Austin. She's an author, and she just truly does a wonderful job of sharing her beautiful garden with her readers over on her blog. And her blog, again, is called Digging. Now, you can find Pam's website by looking up panic.net. That's Pam's last name, or you can find it very easily by looking in the Facebook group for the show, for listeners of the podcast. Because to find this post, if you're in the group, all you're going to need to do is search for the word trees, and Pam's post will pop right up. I need a few more P's in that sentence, and then it'll be a perfect tongue twister. All right, enough of the P's. Now, if you're not in the Facebook group for the show, I always say on every episode, you have a standing invitation to join the listener community over on Facebook. And all you need to do is to head on up to the search bar where you'd search for a friend and type in Daily Gardener Community and then request to join. I would love to meet you in the group. All right, it's time for today's botanical history. Here's botanical history for April 14th. Today is the birthday of the German landscape and flower painter Helene Cramer, who was born on this day, April 14th, in 1844. Helene and her sister Molly were both painters in Hamburg, Germany. Their father, César, had forbid both his girls to become painters. And so the two sisters didn't start painting until middle age. Helene was 38 when she first picked up a brush. Her primary subject was flowers. After studying with other artists and painters, both Helene and Molly exhibited their art around Germany, and they also showed some of their pieces at the 1883 World's Fair in Chicago. Most gardeners say that their favorite painting of Helene's is her work called Marsh Marigolds and Crown Imperials. And it is beautiful. When Helen died in 1916, she was 72 years old. Both she and her sister Molly are buried in Plot 27 of the Garten der Frauen, or the Garden of Women, at the Hamburg-Ohlsdorf Cemetery. And it was on this day, April 14th, in 2020, that the book A Naturalist in the Amazon, the Journals and Writings of Henry Walter Bates was published. Unlike many of his scientist friends and peers, Henry was entirely self-taught. Early in his career, Henry met the great English naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, and by 1848, both Henry and Alfred left England to explore the Amazon rainforest. While Henry stayed in the rainforest for 11 years, Alfred returned to England after 4 years. Although, sadly, all of Alfred's specimens and notes were lost at sea on his voyage home. And this happened after the ship that Alfred was on caught fire and sank. Alfred and the crew were rescued after 10 days adrift in the Atlantic. During his 11 years in the rainforest in Brazil, Henry collected butterflies, and he sent back a whopping 15,000 insect specimens, with over half of his collection listed as brand new discoveries. As Henry wrapped up his time in the rainforest, he had survived both yellow fever and malaria, in addition to many other uncomfortable maladies. Toward the end, it's not surprising to read that Henry had grown weary of the enormous challenges of life as an explorer. He wrote, "I suffered most inconvenience from the difficulty of getting news from the civilized world downriver, from the irregularity of receipt of letters, parcels of books and periodicals, and towards the latter part of my residence, from ill health arising from bad and insufficient food. In the end, after a dozen years away from his family, friends, and civilization, Henry Bates, the great naturalist, could not ignore what had been building in his heart. He was lonely. He wrote, "I was obliged at last to come to the conclusion that the contemplation of nature alone is not sufficient to fill the human heart and mind." In 2014, Henry's Amazon notebooks were digitized, and they are now online to view from the Natural History Museum Library. And in 2018, Henry's remarkable story was shared in an IMAX film called Amazon Adventure. It's time for today's Unearthed Words. Today's Unearthed Words come to us from Ernest Hemingway. This is an excerpt from his book called A Movable Feast. And here is some of what he wrote about spring in this book. With so many trees in the city, you could see the spring coming each day until a night of warm wind would bring it suddenly in one morning. Sometimes the heavy, cold rains would beat it back so that it would seem that it would never come and that you were losing a season out of your life. This was the only truly sad time in Paris because it was unnatural. You expected to be sad in the fall. Part of you died each year when the leaves fell from the trees and their branches were bare against the wind and the cold, wintry light. But you knew there would always be the spring, as you knew the river would flow again after it was frozen. When the cold rains kept on and killed the spring, it was as though a young person had died for no reason. In those days, though, the spring always came, finally, but it was frightening that it had nearly failed. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, James Sowerby by Paul Henderson. This book came out in 2016, and the subtitle is The Enlightenment's Natural Historian. In this book, Paul Henderson introduces us to James Sowerby, arguably one of the best botanical illustrators during the mid-18th to mid-19th centuries. Now, one of the reasons that James was such a successful artist was no doubt due to his extremely high intellect. And James was also one of the period's most knowledgeable natural historians. And Paul introduces James to us this way. This book is the story of a remarkable man, unusual in his breadth of scientific interest, which he applied successfully, unusual in his desire to learn throughout his life and to impart his knowledge widely, unusual in going against the current practices by being his own researcher, writer, illustrator, teacher, publisher, and bookseller. Unusual in his considerable output of innovative, high-quality, and influential works, and unusual in becoming the patriarch of a successful line of natural historians. Well, I've talked about James numerous times on the podcast here. He teamed up with countless botanists during his lifetime, and his illustrations grace the pages of many of their books. As for James, his own masterpiece was called Sowerby's Botany. It was a detailed 36-volume reference on the plants of England. And naturally, the book included over 2,500 hand-colored illustrations. This book is 336 pages of a first-time biography of an incredible artist and scientist, James Sowerby. You can get a copy of James Sowerby by Paul Henderson and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $40. And I just want to say that if you're interested at all in getting a copy of this book, you're going to want to act quickly. I bought my copy, and there are only a handful left. And then after that, copies go for over $1,000 a piece. And that's because this book is now out of print. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. It was on this day, April 14th in 2017, that the Beijing Crabapple Conference began. During the conference, visitors toured the Crabapple Garden, which features many new American cultivars of crabapples like the Brandywine, the Cinderella, Molten Lava, Lollipop, and Madonna, all of which were created by the respected and admired nurseryman from Lake County, Ohio, Jim Zampini. Sadly, during the conference, attendees learned that Jim had passed away at the age of 85. Today, Jim's legacy lives on in his fantastic crabapple varieties like Centurion, Harvest Gold, Lancelot Dwarf, Sugar Time, and the Weeping Candied Apple. Crabapples are small, deciduous trees with densely woven branches, and they feature fragrant and beautiful white, pink, or red petals when they bloom in the spring. Self-sterile, crabapples rely on bees and other insects for pollination, and the trees rarely grow taller than 25 feet high. Generally speaking, it takes 2 to 5 years for a crabapple tree to bear fruit. And one of the ways that crabapples differ from standard apple trees is that they offer smaller fruit. Apples that are less than 2 inches in diameter are considered crabapples. Now, if you want to plant a beautiful mini orchard of crabapple trees, space the saplings 6 to 15 feet apart, and you're going to want to group them on the closer end of the range if you're planting dwarf or more upright varieties. Crabapple trees are just beginning to come into bloom in our 2021 gardens. When they are in flower, few flowering trees can rival their charm. In Polish folklore, apple trees were considered dream trees. Sleeping under apple trees was thought to create a dream-filled sleep. And it was believed that placing an apple under a maiden's pillow could induce a dream of her future husband. And in English folklore, crabapple seeds, known as pips, were thrown into the fire on Valentine's Day Eve. You would chant the name of your own true love. If the pips exploded, your love would be true and would last forever. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Maple Grove and Wyoming, Minnesota, with the help of Paige Mance, Brooke Bierbaum, and Eric Begay. If you want to read today's show notes, just head on over to thedailygardener.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. And don't forget that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. Last but not least, you can always get in touch by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.